So while generations are different, and you mentioned that your generation, both the parents worked. So maybe what you did as a result is maybe you worked harder to make sure that your kids have your, I mean, either the father or mother at home or both parents at home. So sometimes what a generation does to overcompensate for what they went through affects the next generation. And do you see a lot of that happening? Because I feel Gen Z or Generation Z or Z, maybe we call it in India, is dealing with a lot of the actions which were set out to be good, but the consequences aren't always positive in this situation or negative. I don't know, but you try to do something to protect the next generation, but it ends up backfiring. Is that a right observation?
Yeah, that's actually a really keen observation. I co-authored a book called Generation Z, A Century in the Making.
Mm,
And it looked back at the last 100 years of generational changes. And one of the things that we came upon was the influence of the parental generation. And so one of the starkest differences that you've been able to see is we call them like the pendulum swingers. It's where one generation says, I don't like the way that I was raised, so I'm going to do completely opposite. And
mm,
then another generation says, I love the way I was raised, I'm going to do exactly the same. Some of the most notable ones are, and again, not all people in one generation have all parents of another, but typically we call them a parental generation where the majority of the parents are in that generation. So for instance, a number of millennials had baby boomer parents, not exclusively. I had one baby boomer parent and one silent generation parent, but had baby boomer parents. Now, if you go back and you see, millennials have been told they're the me generation, or they've been given trophies, or everybody wins.
mm,
That came from the fact that baby boomers didn't have that, and they had almost complete opposite of that, where it was competitive. It was, you know in some ways their parents were children should be seen and not heard, and so they never wanted to raise their kids that way. So they gave their kids a voice, and they gave their kids all these opportunities because they wanted to. I don't know that they thought at the time they were overcompensating. I think they thought that they were balancing it out. So
yeah.
then you have the millennials being raised very differently. Now, on another note, you have a situation with Gen Xers, who are the parental generation of Gen Zers. Now, something that's happened with that generation is Gen Xers are retreating back to a lot of the ways in which they were raised, and raising Gen Zers, letting them go back out and walk to school, ride their bikes, some of the less protective measures. I used to walk to school, you can walk to school, or
Yeah.
I don't need to argue with your coach that you didn't get to play on the team. I didn't get to play on the team. And so a lot of them are raising their kids to almost grow up just like they did, except for the time and history is different. Like, we
Mm.
have smartphones, and we have internet, and we have, all this technology and pandemics. And so it's not quite the same. So it really just depends, but you can see trends, and it's very interesting to watch. And what I'll be fascinated to see is, as we study Generation Alpha, which are the little ones right now, whose primary parental generation are millennials, is to see how they're raising alphas. Are they raising them more like them, or maybe more like what they wish they would have had from their parents?
Yeah, because you want to, as a collective and also as an individual, you want to kind of prep your child or the next generation for what's to come. And many times you do that with the best intention, um, and but you can't really tell where this goes, right? Like for instance, you want to take something as relevant as Chat GPT, which is out there right now, and AI powered tools, which are seeming to threaten a lot of people, but seeming also to give a lot of people hope, because it's the next stage of technological evolution, which is going to so-called aid our progress, right? I don't know how much more progress we want, but it's one of those things that people are talking about. So as a result, post-pandemic, and also there's a present war in Ukraine, which are both big global events, and of course the global warming and climate change, which are kind of the premise, or the kind of the background on this canvas that we're going to sort of paint the future picture of. And of course, the people in the Ukraine, like say the kids or the young adults, are definitely not going to have the same perspective as young adults or children in America or India even. So um, I don't even really have a question for this, but what happens is, what are the things that a parent or a person can do? Because as you said, I would like my child to run around on the beach and be more with nature, and not just be locked up in an apartment on an iPad. But as you said, the thing is, this, the situation is that schools are going to be online or learning is going to be online. So you have to kind of, I wouldn't say marry the ideas, but kind of also just have a bit of sense to kind of take yourself out of the situation, but also look at it with a broader kind of perspective and say, you know what, this is what I want, but this is also the reality of the situation. So how does someone navigate dealing with things that still haven't really played out?
Right. Well, I mean, and that's all about the context. You know, as I go back to that example of Gen Xers raising Gen Zers to say, I want you to go out and play. I don't want you to sit on your device. I want you to feel safe. I don't want you to worry about, getting kidnapped. And I'm not going to worry about that. The reality is that that's not necessarily the world we live in.
Yeah.
So while they can have those aspirational values, they also have to assess the context of the things that are going on around them. For instance, like saying, I really want my child to not have social media accounts. So I'm not going to let him or her have a social media account until they're 18. But the reality is that kid is then going to like sneak a social media account, do things behind their back. And so, because the reality is that such a dominating force of our culture today. So I think what really needs to happen is particularly those that are influencing younger people, is to just have a really good grasp on reality and trying to find ways to blend all of it. So that's where things like, okay, yeah, you can have a social media account, you can be online, but like, let's go out for a walk today together. And so everything becomes more transparent, because, one thing that people always ask me is, how do you know if Gen Z is behaving like Gen Z, or they're just behaving like young people would always have behaved? And so the reality is young people are defiant, especially in adolescent development. They're pushing back and they're challenging the norms. And so, as someone who thinks that they know best, which they probably do in some ways, they also just have to be aware of the context of the facts that young people are going to be young people. And the more that you can have a better idea of what reality looks like and try to meet them where they're at, that's going to be better served for everybody.
Right. And that's absolutely fair, I think, right? You can't deny a teenager the teenage experience, but I feel, maybe I'm sounding very old when I say this, but there's a lot that Gen Z is dealing with because of the social change that has happened, that has transpired over the past, say, even 3-4 years, right? Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, with all aspects of life, with technology, with education, with gender, with sexuality. And there are so many things that, that each thing in itself can be, a podcast series, not just an episode. But what are some of the things that you've observed before we talk about the things that you're doing and observing on a sort of in an academic setting? What are some of the major, I wouldn't say issues, but major kind of talking points that Generation Z is dealing with that the previous generations didn't have to?
Yeah, well, and I think you bring up a really good point too, because when we're looking at current events and we're looking at context and we're looking at big things like global pandemics, I was in my 40s when the pandemic hit. I had a lot of life experience underway. I not that I knew how to handle it, because no one did, but I feel like I was in a better situation than my 5th grade daughter, who didn't know. She was like 10 and didn't really know what was going on. And so, part of that is just kind of understanding these world events that are happening around us, and knowing that, again, we're just more globally connected than we have ever been before. And so something like, as you're talking about all the things you're talking about, those aren't isolated anymore. I mean, think about it. 100 years ago, it was before we even had automobiles, and, people couldn't even leave their neighborhoods. So you didn't know what was happening down the street. And now we know what's happening all over the world in an instant. And so Gen Zers are carrying that weight of the world on them. I mean, when I was young, I had an encyclopedia. I could read about topics, but I didn't get news feeds every day about how, global warming is going to kill us, and about politicians doing this, and about the pandemic doing that. And so it's a heavy weight for them to have on them. And so how are they're how are they navigating it? I mean, it's interesting. They've got a lot of the emotional and mental health pressures that young people have just by virtue of making friends or fear of failure in school and all that stuff. But then they're also worried about the fact that, our planet might be dying, and like, people are not being inclusive and creating really restrictive laws and policies, and they see it every single day. And so it's been, for many of them, it's hard to navigate because it's just overpowering of the information. But for others, it's really kind of created a fire in their bellies to go do something. And I think that's the positive side of all of this.
Yeah, because it just sounds, I'm trying to put myself in it back as a teenager in today's time. And yeah, even just being a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, whatever it is, you just want to be a part of something bigger than you, right? You want to be accepted, you want to be validated. And I can only imagine how hard or scary it is for someone going, you know what, beyond just finding someone, who finds me attractive, I have to save the world. It's
Right.
it's kind of big.
Yeah, I know.
And I read this article. I'm sure you come across some form of it, or basically how a lot of these children or young adults are basically giving up on their youth at a younger age. They're not being so kind of happy-go-lucky. They're not sort of so free-spirited. They're like, no, I need to be more secure with my job. I need to I don't know the various aspects of it in detail, but it's like they're becoming much more responsible and becoming adults at a much younger age. Is that a true sort of sign of them?
Yeah, well, and yes, and that was the trajectory pre-pandemic for sure, was this idea that like, I need to save the world. I mean, you start looking at how many, young kids, teenagers are freelancing, they've got their own businesses, they're nonprofits, they're inventing things. When I was that age, I was playing with my friends after school and going to like basketball practice like that.
Yeah.
And I'm a real go-getter, and I didn't know anybody who was doing that. And this is becoming more of the norm.
Yeah.
The interesting part about that is were becoming more kind of professionally and socially engaged at a younger age. The pandemic did set back a lot of young people emotionally and mentally in their development. And so you have these, you have a 15-year-old that has their own business, but doesn't have a lot of the social skills perhaps to run that business because of, there's a lot of other factors in Gen Z for having lower social competence, but the pandemic certainly didn't help. And so now you got this like one generation that's off the charts on this professional kind of career, save the world trajectory, being an adult at a young age. But then the other side of them is going into adulthood developmentally later because the pandemic set them back socially, educationally, and so forth. And I think the best thing to know for all of this is we'll probably figure it out in about 10 years when we look back and see who these people have become, when they're trying to go uber speed into adulthood, but still lingering way back in childhood, even more so than maybe a non-pandemic cohort would have.